The cruelest kind of loneliness is being invisible in the very place you call home. Snow pressed against the towering windows of Blackthorn Hall, while the old mansion groaned beneath the weight of another endless winter night. Candlelight flickered weakly along the endless stone corridors, casting trembling shadows across portraits of dead Ashfords whose painted eyes seemed to follow every servant that passed beneath them. Yet among all the quiet footsteps echoing through the manor, none were softer than Eleanor Vale's. She moved through Blackthorn Hall like a whisper no one bothered to hear. At 24, Eleanor had lived inside the Duke's estate for nearly 2 years, though most of the household still forgot she existed until they needed something mended, cleaned, organized, or quietly fixed without attention drawn to the mistake. She repaired torn gloves beside the kitchen fire after midnight. She cataloged forgotten books in the freezing library while storms rattled the glass. She carried fresh flowers into darkened rooms no one entered anymore. And every evening at precisely 9 o'clock, she prepared a tray of black tea for Duke Lucian Ashford exactly the way he preferred it: 2 sugar cubes, no cream, served hot enough that steam still curled from the porcelain by the time it reached his study upstairs. No one had instructed her to memorize his habits. She simply had. The Dukes returned from the West Wing. One maid whispered nervously as hurried footsteps sounded across the marble floor below. "Don't look directly at him." Eleanor lowered her gaze automatically as the servants scattered like frightened birds. Then he appeared. Duke Lucian Ashford descended the staircase dressed entirely in black, one gloved hand resting lightly against the polished railing while shadows gathered beneath his sharp gray eyes. At 39, he carried the cold elegance of a man carved from winter itself. His dark hair, touched faintly with silver near the temples, only deepened the severity of his expression. The servants bowed quickly as he crossed the hall without acknowledging any of them. He rarely did. Since the death of his wife 5 years earlier, Blackthorn Hall had become less a home and more a mausoleum where silence ruled beside him like a second ghost. Lucian passed within a few feet of Eleanor without looking at her once. Yet she still stepped quietly forward moments later to straighten the cuff of the coat he had carelessly left draped near the fire. "Poor thing," an older maid murmured after he disappeared into the library. "I swear his grace doesn't even know the girl's name." Eleanor offered only a faint smile and lowered her eyes again. "That's quite all right," she said softly. But later that night, while snow hammered against the mansion windows and the grandfather clock struck 9, Eleanor carried the Duke's tea upstairs herself after realizing one of the younger servants had become too frightened to enter the library alone. The corridor outside his study stood silent except for the crackling fire within. Eleanor carefully balanced the silver tray in trembling hands before nudging the heavy oak door open just enough to slip inside unnoticed. Duke Lucian stood near the massive fireplace with one hand braced against the mantel, his tall figure outlined by golden flames. Papers covered the desk untouched beside him. A half-empty crystal glass rested nearby. He looked exhausted in a way sleep could never repair. Eleanor quietly set the tea down near his chair, meaning to leave before he noticed her presence at all. But as she turned toward the door, Lucian suddenly spoke without lifting his gaze from the fire. "Leave it there." His deep voice cut gently through the silence. Eleanor froze. "Yes, Your Grace," she whispered. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the Duke's eyes shifted toward her. Only briefly. Only a second. Yet something unreadable flickered across his expression as if he had suddenly realized another living soul occupied the room beside him. Then his gaze drifted downward toward the untouched tea tray. "Who prepared this?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the edge of her sleeve. But before she could answer, a sharp gust of wind rattled the windows violently, swallowing the moment whole. The wind continued clawing against the tall windows long after Eleanor slipped from the library, though the sound of the Duke's voice followed her through every corridor of Blackthorn Hall. Who prepared this? Such a simple question. Yet no one had spoken words about her with genuine curiosity in years. Eleanor descended the staircase quietly, her fingers still trembling around the empty silver tray, while candlelight stretched thin shadows across the walls beside her. Downstairs, the kitchen remained warm with late evening activity. Pots simmered softly. Servants whispered over unfinished chores. Mrs. Aldrich, The stern housekeeper who governed Blackthorn Hall with military precision glanced up immediately the moment Eleanor entered. "You were gone too long," she said sharply. "His Grace does not enjoy unnecessary delays." Eleanor lowered her eyes. "I apologize." But before Mrs. Aldridge could continue, another servant hurried breathlessly into the kitchen. The Duke asked who prepared the tea. Silence fell instantly. Even the crackling hearth seemed quieter. One of the younger maids blinked in confusion. "He asked about the tea?" "Twice," the footman replied. Mr. Whitmore could not answer because none of us knew who delivered it. Mrs. Aldridge's gaze slowly shifted toward Eleanor. Surprise flickered briefly beneath her composed expression before disappearing just as quickly. "It was Eleanor," she said at last. "It has always been Eleanor." The servants exchanged startled looks. One maid actually frowned as though trying to remember where Eleanor usually worked within the manor. Another whispered softly, "I thought she only handled the library." Eleanor forced a polite smile despite the familiar ache tightening quietly inside her chest. Invisible. Even now. Especially now. Mrs. Aldridge cleared her throat stiffly. "Finish polishing the west corridor before bed." "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor took the lantern without complaint and disappeared into the endless upper halls while the whispers resumed behind her. Blackthorn Hall slept uneasily after midnight. The ancient estate creaked beneath winter winds while snow buried the gardens outside beneath thick, white silence. Eleanor moved carefully along the west corridor with a cloth draped over one arm, polishing silver candle holders no guest had admired in years. Most of the manor remained abandoned now. Entire wings stood dark and untouched since the Duchess's death 5 years earlier. No music echoed through the ballroom anymore. No laughter drifted from the drawing rooms. Even the servants walked softer here, as though afraid grief itself still lingered beneath the ceilings. Eleanor paused beside one tall window overlooking the frozen courtyard below. Snowflakes spiraled endlessly beneath the moonlight, pale and distant like forgotten memories. She tightened her shawl against the cold. "You missed a spot." Eleanor startled softly at the deep voice behind her. She turned too quickly, nearly dropping the polishing cloth entirely. Duke Lucian Ashford stood at the far end of the corridor, dressed in a dark wool coat, one gloved hand resting behind his back. Candlelight carved sharp shadows across his face, while his gray eyes remained unreadable. Eleanor immediately lowered her gaze. "Forgive me, Your Grace." Lucian stepped closer slowly, his footsteps muted against the carpet runner beneath them. "You are awake late. There is still work unfinished." "At this hour?" Eleanor hesitated. "Blackthorn Hall requires constant care." Something flickered in his expression then. Not mockery, not irritation. Something quieter, more tired. Lucian glanced toward the polished silver holder beside her before speaking again. "You prepared the tea tonight." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the cloth. "Yes, Your Grace." Silence stretched between them while wind rattled faintly beyond the windows. Lucian studied her for several long seconds as though trying to recall a face half forgotten from an old dream. "You have done so before." It was not a question. "Every evening," Eleanor admitted softly. The Duke's brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. 5 years of silence seemed to gather heavily around him then. 5 years of grief, of routine, of never noticing the quiet girl who moved through his home like candle smoke. At last, Lucian looked away first. "The tea is always exactly right," he said quietly. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Such small words should not have mattered. Yet warmth spread painfully through her chest, all the same. Lucian turned toward the darkness at the end of the corridor, his expression distant once more. "Get some rest, Miss Vale." It was the first time he had ever spoken her name. By morning, the entire manor had convinced itself the moment in the west corridor meant nothing. Servants returned to their routines. Fires crackled through the lower halls. Snow continued falling beyond the tall windows in slow silver sheets. Yet something subtle had shifted inside Blackthorn Hall, something no one could name aloud. Eleanor felt it first in the silence. Usually, Duke Lucian Ashford passed through the manor without noticing the people around him. His gaze remained distant, fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the present. But now, more than once throughout the morning, she caught his eyes lingering briefly whenever she entered a room. Never long enough to seem improper. Never enough to invite conversation. Yet enough to unsettle her pulse all the same. Eleanor spent the afternoon reorganizing the neglected music room on the second floor, a chamber untouched since the Duchess's death. Dust cloaked the grand piano beside the windows while faded sheet music remained scattered across the bench exactly as it had been years earlier. Mrs. Aldrich had ordered the room cleaned for arriving guests expected later that week, though everyone knew the Duke rarely entertained visitors anymore. Eleanor carefully lifted a stack of yellowed compositions from the piano and paused when she recognized one of the songs. Moonlight Reverie, the Duchess's favorite piece according to old servants' whispers. Her fingers brushed lightly across the worn pages before she quietly began returning them to order. You should not touch those. Eleanor turned instantly at the sound of Lucien's voice behind her. The Duke stood near the doorway, his dark coat still dusted faintly with snow from outside. Gray winter light framed him in cold silence, while his expression remained unreadable. Eleanor immediately lowered the music sheets. Forgive me, Your Grace. I was only organizing them. Lucien crossed the room slowly, each step measured. Against the old wooden floor. No one enters this room. Mrs. Aldrich requested it be cleaned before the guests arrive. A muscle tightened faintly in his jaw. For a moment, Eleanor thought he might order her to leave. Instead, Lucien's gaze drifted toward the piano itself, toward memories lingering like ghosts between the dust-covered walls. My wife used to play every evening, he said quietly. Eleanor remained still. The Duke almost never spoke of the Duchess. Most servants avoided mentioning her name entirely. Lucien stepped closer to the piano, one gloved hand resting lightly against the polished wood. After she died, I had the room closed. His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion. Eleanor's chest tightened softly at the sound. It is a beautiful room, she whispered before thinking better of it. Lucien glanced toward her then. Candlelight from the hallway touched the sharp lines of his face, while silence stretched between them once more. Beautiful things do not remain beautiful forever, he said at last. Eleanor looked down at the music sheets in her hands. Sometimes they simply wait for someone to notice them again. The words escaped before she could stop them. Immediately, she regretted the boldness. But Lucien did not rebuke her. Instead, something flickered briefly across his expression. Surprise perhaps, or recognition. Then suddenly, a loud crash shattered the stillness downstairs. Both of them startled as voices echoed faintly from the main hall below. Eleanor hurried toward the doorway instinctively. I should help. But as she moved past him, the edge of her sleeve caught against the piano bench. The stack of music slipped from her hands, scattering pages across the floor in soft white waves. I am so sorry. Eleanor quickly knelt to gather them before the papers could wrinkle. Another servant might have panicked beneath the Duke's stare. Yet Eleanor simply moved quietly, carefully smoothing each sheet as though preserving something fragile mattered more than her own embarrassment. Lucien watched her in silence. Then one page drifted farther beneath the piano beyond her reach. Without thinking, Eleanor smiled faintly at herself before, leaning sideways to retrieve it. It was only the smallest smile, barely there at all. But the moment Lucien saw it, something inside his chest tightened unexpectedly. Warmth, gentle and sudden, like sunlight breaking through winter clouds after years of cold darkness. Eleanor rose carefully and handed the music back to him. There, she whispered softly. Lucien stared at her for one long breath too many. Because for the first time in years, he realized Blackthorn Hall no longer felt entirely empty when she was near. The next morning, Blackthorn Hall awakened beneath a sky the color of ash. Snow covered the estate in thick silence while pale winter light filtered weakly through the towering windows. Yet for the first time in years, Duke Lucien Ashford did not retreat immediately into the isolation of his study. Instead, he lingered. The servants noticed it first. He paused in hallways he normally crossed without thought. His gaze drifted toward rooms he once ignored entirely. And more than once throughout the morning, he seemed distracted by something no one else could see. Eleanor noticed it too, though she tried not to. She spent the early hours arranging fresh linens in the guest chambers alongside two younger maids who whispered endlessly beside her. The Duke actually spoke during breakfast. One girl murmured in astonishment while fluffing pillows near the fireplace. Mr. Whitmore nearly dropped the coffee tray. Perhaps the arriving guests have put him in a mood, the second maid suggested nervously. Eleanor remained quiet as she folded blankets with careful hands. But then the first maid lowered her voice further. "No. I heard Mrs. Aldridge say His Grace asked about someone this morning." Eleanor's fingers stilled slightly against the wool blanket. "Who?" "The quiet girl from the library." Heat rose softly beneath Eleanor's cheeks before she quickly lowered her eyes again. I am sure it meant nothing. But deep inside, uncertainty had already begun unfolding through her chest like fragile paper. Because the Duke had spoken her name twice now. By afternoon, snow fell harder against the windows while the manor prepared for the arrival of Lucien's distant relatives expected before the weekend. Footmen carried firewood through the halls. Chandeliers were polished. Dining tables stretched beneath fresh linen cloths untouched since last winter. Eleanor moved quietly through the west drawing room, arranging white roses into crystal vases, while soft classical music drifted faintly from somewhere downstairs. She paused briefly beside the window to adjust one crooked stem. "You prefer white roses?" Eleanor startled gently. Lucien stood near the doorway once again, his dark figure framed by candlelight and snowfall beyond the corridor behind him. Eleanor lowered her gaze immediately. "They seemed suitable for winter, Your Grace." Lucien stepped farther into the room. His eyes moved slowly over the flowers before settling on her once more. "My wife preferred them as well." Eleanor hesitated carefully. Then perhaps the room remembered. Silence followed her words, deep and lingering. Lucien studied her in a way that unsettled something tender inside her chest because he no longer looked through her anymore. He was looking at her, truly looking. Outside, wind rattled the tall windows softly while the fire crackled low within the marble hearth. "How long have you been here, Miss Vale?" he asked quietly. "Nearly 2 years." Lucien's expression darkened faintly as though disturbed by the answer itself. "And before that?" Eleanor smoothed one rose petal carefully between her fingertips. "My father passed away in Vermont. Afterward, there was nowhere else to go." Her voice remained calm, though loneliness threaded quietly beneath every word. Lucien said nothing for a long moment. Then his gaze drifted toward her hands arranging the flowers. "You make this house feel less cold." Eleanor looked up before she could stop herself. Their eyes met fully then for the first time without interruption or lowered gazes between them. Gray against blue, winter against softness. Something unspoken passed silently through the room. Then suddenly, footsteps echoed rapidly down the hallway outside. Mrs. Aldridge appeared moments later, stopping abruptly when she noticed them standing together beside the roses. Surprise flashed across her face, before propriety quickly returned. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace. The carriage from Boston has arrived earlier than expected." Lucien's expression cooled instantly, the old distance returning like armor settling back into place. "Very well." Mrs. Aldridge glanced briefly toward Eleanor before lowering her eyes. "Miss Vale, the East Parlor still requires preparation." "Of course." Eleanor stepped back immediately, gathering her gloves from the nearby chair. But as she passed Lucien, his voice stopped her once more. "Leave the roses." Eleanor turned slightly. Lucien looked toward the arrangement she had created beside the window while snow drifted endlessly outside. "They belong here." And for reasons she could not explain, those 3 quiet words stayed with her long after she left the room. That evening, Blackthorn Hall glowed with more candlelight than it had seen in years. Carriages lined the snowy drive while servants hurried through the corridors carrying silver trays and fresh coal for the fires. Guests from Boston and New York filled the grand rooms with soft laughter and expensive perfume, their voices echoing beneath crystal chandeliers that had long stood dark and forgotten. Yet despite the warmth and music returning briefly to the manor, Eleanor felt more invisible than ever. She moved quietly between guests with lowered eyes, adjusting curtains, refilling tea, straightening forgotten gloves left beside velvet chairs. No one noticed her except when they needed something. It had always been easier that way. "Careful with the glasses," one noblewoman muttered sharply as Eleanor passed nearby. "These old estates hire anyone these days." Eleanor simply nodded and continued walking. But from across the crowded drawing room, Lucien Ashford heard every word. His expression hardened faintly though he said nothing aloud. Instead, his gaze followed Eleanor as she disappeared through the far doorway carrying another silver tray in steady hands. Strange. He had spent years ignoring every servant in Blackthorn Hall equally. Yet now the sound of careless words spoken toward her unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Later that night, snow continued, falling heavily beyond the windows while music drifted softly from the ballroom downstairs. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet east hallway arranging fresh candles into wall sconces when distant voices carried unexpectedly from the servants' stairwell nearby. She paused instinctively upon hearing her own name. "I still do not understand why the Duke notices her now," one maid whispered. "She barely speaks." Another voice answered softly, "Perhaps because she looks sad all the time." A short silence followed before the older cook sighed heavily. "That girl has always looked like someone waiting to disappear." Eleanor lowered her eyes quietly. She should have walked away. Instead, she remained frozen beside the candlelight while old memories rose painfully through her chest. Did she ever have family? Only her father, a pastor somewhere in Vermont. The cook's voice softened further. "There was a man once too, years ago before she came here." Eleanor's breath caught faintly. "A fiancé?" "Almost. They say his family ended the engagement after meeting her. Claimed she was too quiet, too plain. One of them supposedly said no one even noticed when she entered a room." The younger maid laughed awkwardly. "That is cruel." "Cruel, perhaps," the cook murmured sadly, "but not entirely wrong." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly as the words settled heavily inside her once more. No one notices when she enters a room. She had heard those exact words before. Standing beneath church lights in a pale blue dress she never wore again. Watching a future quietly vanish from her hands while everyone around her avoided looking directly at her pity. The memory still hurt, more than she ever allowed herself to admit. Slowly, Eleanor lifted the candle tray again and turned away from the stairwell before anyone realized she had overheard them. But the moment she stepped into the corridor, she froze completely. Lucien stood several feet away beneath the dim wall sconces, his tall figure half-shadowed against the dark wood paneling. He had heard everything. Silence spread between them instantly. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the silver tray, while humiliation burned softly beneath her skin. She lowered her eyes at once. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not mean to linger." Lucien said nothing at first. His gray eyes remained fixed on her face with an intensity that made her pulse unsteady. Then quietly, almost carefully, he spoke. "They were wrong." Eleanor blinked in confusion. Lucien stepped closer slowly, the firelight catching faint silver threads near his temples. "About no one noticing you." Her breath caught softly. No one had ever defended her before. Not then. Not now. Not for something so small and painfully true. Eleanor forced a faint smile despite the ache rising in her chest. "It does not matter anymore." But Lucien's expression darkened unexpectedly, because somehow, hearing those words hurt him more than it should have. "It matters," he said quietly. And for the first time in many years, Duke Lucien Ashford realized he could not bear the thought of Eleanor believing she was forgettable. The storm worsened by midnight. Snow buried the gardens beneath nearly 2 feet of white, while icy wind pressed violently against the ancient windows of Blackthorn Hall. Most of the guests had retired upstairs hours earlier, their laughter fading into silence beneath the heavy weight of winter. Only the servants remained awake below stairs, tending fires and extinguishing candles one room at a time. Yet inside the Duke's study, a single lamp still burned. Lucien Ashford stood beside the tall windows with untouched whiskey resting near his hand while Eleanor's words lingered relentlessly through his thoughts. It does not matter anymore. He had heard grief before. He carried enough of it himself to recognize its shape instantly. But there had been something uniquely painful about the calm acceptance in her voice, as though she truly believed she deserved to disappear quietly through life unnoticed by everyone around her. Lucien tightened his jaw faintly. Somehow, the thought unsettled him more than the storm outside. A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Enter." Mr. Whitmore stepped carefully into the study. "Your Grace, Mrs. Aldridge wished to inform you the East Wing fires have been secured for the night." Lucien barely nodded. "Very good." The butler hesitated before turning toward the door again. Then he added quietly, "Miss Vale remained behind to finish the lower gallery." Lucien's eyes lifted immediately. "At this hour?" She insisted the guests might pass through there tomorrow morning. The Duke glanced toward the clock beside the fireplace. Nearly midnight. Snow still hammered the windows relentlessly. "Send someone to assist her." I offered, Your Grace. Whitmore lowered his gaze respectfully. She said the younger maids were exhausted. Lucien said nothing for a moment. Then quietly, Very well. You may go. Once alone again, the Duke stared into the fire with growing restlessness. He tried returning to his paperwork, tried reading correspondence left untouched on the desk, but concentration escaped him entirely. Instead, his thoughts drifted repeatedly toward the lower gallery where Eleanor remained working alone while the storm darkened around the estate. Strange. 5 years ago, he would not have cared. 5 years ago, nothing beyond survival and routine had mattered after losing his wife. Yet now he found himself listening unconsciously for footsteps in the hallway outside. Waiting. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Lucien finally realized what disturbed him most. Eleanor had not brought his evening tea. Every night for 2 years, without fail, the silver tray appeared beside the fire at exactly the same hour. Quiet. Precise. Familiar. Tonight the table beside his chair remained empty. Lucien stared at it longer than necessary before abruptly setting down his papers altogether. Irritation flickered briefly through him, though he knew it made no sense. It was only tea. Only routine. Yet the absence of it left the room feeling colder somehow. Empty. Before he could reconsider the impulse, Lucien rose and stepped into the dark hallway. The mansion slept heavily around him as he descended the grand staircase alone. Shadows stretched endlessly across the lower corridors while distant wind echoed faintly through the walls. At last, soft candlelight flickered beneath the doorway leading toward the lower gallery. Lucien slowed near the entrance. Eleanor stood atop a small ladder beside the far wall, adjusting one final candle sconce near the ceiling. Her loose brown curls had fallen slightly from their pins while exhaustion softened the delicate lines of her face. She looked impossibly small beneath the vast gallery around her. Yet despite the hour, despite the cold, she still worked carefully as though every forgotten corner of Blackthorn Hall deserved tenderness. Then suddenly the ladder shifted unevenly against the polished floor. Eleanor gasped softly as her balance faltered. Before she could fall, Lucien crossed the distance instantly and caught the ladder firmly with one hand. Eleanor froze above him, her blue eyes wide with surprise. Silence flooded the room. Lucien steadied the ladder without releasing it. You should not be doing this alone, he said quietly. Eleanor's breath trembled faintly in the cold air. I did not realize anyone was awake. Lucien looked up at her then, truly looked at her, candlelight glowing softly against her pale skin while snow whispered beyond the tall windows behind them. Neither did I, he admitted. And for the first time in many years, Duke Lucien Ashford understood what it meant to wait for someone's presence without realizing it until they were suddenly absent. The storm did not ease for 3 days. Snow swallowed the roads leading away from Blackthorn Hall while icy wind howled endlessly across the cliffs beyond the estate. Guests remained trapped inside the manor with growing irritation, pacing through drawing rooms and complaining softly beside the fires. But Lucien Ashford noticed none of it, because for the first time in years, his attention kept drifting toward someone else entirely, toward the quiet woman who moved through the halls with lowered eyes and tired hands, toward Eleanor Vale. He began noticing things he should have seen long ago. The way she always carried extra candles through dark corridors before sunset. The way she paused beside elderly servants to help them without being asked. The way her soft voice calmed nervous maids faster than stern commands ever could. She existed within Blackthorn Hall like warmth hidden beneath winter ash. Subtle, constant, unnoticed until suddenly impossible to ignore. And perhaps most dangerous of all, Lucien had begun searching for her without meaning to. His eyes found her instinctively whenever he entered a room. His thoughts lingered on small details no man should remember. The color of ribbon she tied around fresh flowers. The sound of her footsteps in the library after midnight. The faint sadness behind her smile whenever she thought no one was watching. It unsettled him deeply. Late on the third evening, Lucien stood alone beside the fireplace in his study while snow battered the windows with relentless force. The grandfather clock struck 9 softly through the silence. His gaze shifted automatically toward the small table beside his chair. Empty again. No tea. A strange heaviness settled quietly inside his chest. Before he could dismiss it, someone knocked lightly against the study door. Enter. Mrs. Aldrich stepped inside with unusual hesitation. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace." Lucian immediately sensed something wrong. "What is it?" "Miss Vale has taken ill." The words landed harder than they should have. Lucian's expression darkened instantly. "Ill? A fever, I believe. She collapsed briefly while assisting in the East Wing this afternoon." Mrs. Aldrich folded her hands tightly together. "The physician cannot reach the estate until the road's clear." Silence filled the room. Then Lucian set down the untouched whiskey glass beside him with quiet finality. "Which room?" Mrs. Aldrich blinked in surprise. "The small servants' quarters near the North Hall." Lucian was already moving toward the door before she finished speaking. The north corridor remained colder than the rest of the manor, its narrow hallways lit only by dim wall sconces trembling against the draught. Lucian stopped outside Eleanor's room for half a second before pushing the door open himself. The chamber was painfully modest. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, one small window frosted white with snow. Eleanor lay beneath heavy blankets, her cheeks pale against the dim candlelight, while loose strands of brown hair framed her exhausted face. She looked impossibly fragile in the tiny room. Lucian stepped closer slowly. "Has she eaten?" "Very little," Mrs. Aldrich admitted quietly behind him. Eleanor stirred faintly at the sound of voices. Her blue eyes opened slowly before widening in confusion upon seeing him beside her bed. "Your Grace." Her voice came out weak and rough with fever. "You should not be here." Lucian ignored the quiet protest entirely. Instead, he removed his gloves and rested one hand lightly against her forehead. Warm. Far too warm. Something tight and unfamiliar twisted sharply inside his chest. Fear. Eleanor looked at him through exhaustion and confusion, clearly unable to understand why the Duke himself stood inside her small room while snow raged beyond the windows. Lucian pulled the nearby chair closer and sat beside the bed without hesitation. "The physician cannot arrive tonight," he said quietly. "So I will remain until your fever breaks." Eleanor blinked slowly as though she had misheard him entirely. "There is no reason for you to trouble yourself." Lucian's gray eyes remained fixed on her face, steady and unreadable beneath the candlelight. "And yet," he said softly, "I could not leave." Outside, winter storms swallowed the world in darkness. But inside the small servant's room, for the first time in many years, Duke Lucian Ashford stayed beside another human being, not out of duty, guilt, or obligation. He stayed because the thought of Eleanor suffering alone had suddenly become unbearable. The fever lasted through the night. Snow continued falling beyond the narrow window while candlelight trembled softly against the walls of Eleanor's small room. Most of Blackthorn Hall slept in silence, unaware that the Duke himself remained seated beside a servant's bedside long after midnight. Lucian Ashford had not intended to stay. At least, that was what he told himself during the first hour. Then the second passed. Then the third. Yet each time he rose quietly from the chair intending to leave. Eleanor stirred faintly beneath the blankets, as though sensing the emptiness beside her even through fevered sleep. And somehow, he always sat back down again. The room smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Small things rested carefully upon the shelves beside her bed. A worn Bible. A pressed white flower hidden between pages. A cracked porcelain teacup repaired so delicately it was almost impossible to notice the fracture line. Lucian found himself studying every detail with growing unease. Because nothing inside this room belonged to someone careless or forgettable. Eleanor shifted weakly against the pillows, soft exhaustion tightening her expression. Then quietly, almost unconsciously, she whispered, "Father." Lucian's gaze lifted immediately toward her face. Her brow furrowed faintly beneath the fever while her fingers curled weakly against the blanket. "I am trying," she murmured softly. "I truly am." Something inside Lucian's chest tightened painfully at the sound. Loneliness recognized loneliness. He understood that now, more than he wished to admit. Without thinking, Lucian reached forward and adjusted the blanket higher against her shoulders. His movements remained careful, almost hesitant, as though afraid she might disappear if touched too suddenly. Eleanor slowly opened her eyes moments later. Confusion flickered there first, then surprise. "You are still here," she whispered weakly. Lucian leaned back slightly in the chair beside her bed. Apparently, a faint smile touched Eleanor's lips despite her exhaustion. Small, fragile, but real. Lucian felt that strange warmth again immediately, sudden and dangerous beneath his ribs. Eleanor studied him quietly through the dim candlelight. You should sleep, Your Grace. I have not slept particularly well in years. The honesty surprised even him. Eleanor blinked softly at the quiet confession. Snow brushed gently against the window while silence settled around them once more, though somehow it no longer felt cold. When my father became ill, Eleanor said quietly after a moment, I used to sit beside him during storms exactly like this one. Lucian listened without interrupting. He hated thunder, she admitted with the faintest trace of amusement. He always pretended otherwise, but I knew. Her tired smile faded gradually afterward. After he passed, silence became harder than storms. Lucian's gaze remained fixed on her face. Candlelight softened the sadness lingering there, while exhaustion pulled faint shadows beneath her eyes. Blackthorn Hall is very quiet, she whispered. Lucian looked away briefly toward the frost-covered window. It was not always. Eleanor hesitated before speaking again. You loved her very much. The words carried no jealousy, no judgment, only understanding. Lucian remained silent for several long seconds. Then at last, he nodded once. I thought losing her meant the rest of my life had already ended. Eleanor's blue eyes softened gently. Perhaps grief simply convinces us no light remains because it is afraid we might survive it. Lucian stared at her then, truly stared at her, while something old and frozen inside him shifted painfully beneath the warmth of her words. No one had spoken to him like this in years. Not with pity, not with fear, just quiet honesty beneath candlelight and snowfall. Then suddenly, Eleanor swayed slightly as dizziness overtook her again. Instantly Lucian moved forward, steadying her carefully before she could slip sideways against the pillows. His hand remained lightly against her shoulder while her breathing slowed gradually beneath the closeness between them. Neither spoke. The moment stretched silently around them. Too intimate, too gentle. Eleanor lowered her gaze first. You are kind, she whispered faintly. Lucian's expression darkened almost imperceptibly, because kindness was not the word people used for him anymore. Had not used for many years. Yet somehow, hearing it from her unsettled him more deeply than any accusation ever could. Outside, winter storms still swallowed the world beyond Blackthorn Hall. But inside the small servant's room, something warm had begun breathing quietly back to life between two lonely souls neither of them fully understood yet. By the fourth morning, Eleanor's fever had finally begun to fade. Snow still covered Blackthorn Hall in pale silence, but sunlight appeared weakly through the clouds for the first time in days, casting silver light across the frozen estate. The guests downstairs celebrated the clearing weather with renewed energy. Carriages would soon be able to leave. Conversations returned to normal. Laughter echoed once more through the grand dining room. Yet Lucian Ashford noticed only one thing. Eleanor was no longer smiling. It happened gradually enough that no one else would have seen it. The servants simply assumed her exhaustion lingered after illness. Mrs. Aldridge remarked that Miss Vale had become quieter than usual, but Lucian recognized the difference instantly because he had begun watching her too carefully. Before the fever, Eleanor's smiles had always appeared softly without warning. Tiny things, brief warmth when helping nervous maids, gentle amusement while arranging flowers. The quiet kindness in her eyes whenever she believed herself alone. Now those moments had vanished entirely. She still performed every duty perfectly. She still moved gracefully through the manor halls with calm politeness. But something inside her had retreated behind invisible walls. And somehow, Lucian knew he was the reason. That realization followed him relentlessly through the day. He found himself replaying every moment beside her sickbed during the storm. Every word exchanged in candlelight. Every dangerous feeling awakening slowly inside his chest afterward. Perhaps Eleanor had realized the same thing he had. The distance between them. Duke and servant. Grief and hope. Winter and sunlight. By evening, the ache of her quiet withdrawal had become impossible to ignore. Lucian stood alone in the library staring at untouched papers while rain replaced snow softly against the windows outside. The storm had passed, yet the manor somehow felt colder than before. He heard Eleanor's footsteps before seeing her. Soft. Familiar now. She entered carrying his evening tea tray with careful hands before setting it beside the fireplace exactly where she always did. "Thank you," Lucien said immediately. Eleanor paused faintly at the unexpected gratitude. "Of course, Your Grace." Then she turned to leave almost at once. Too quickly. Lucien's jaw tightened softly. "Miss Vale." Eleanor stopped near the doorway, without facing him fully. "Yes." Silence stretched between them while rain whispered against the glass. Lucien struggled unexpectedly for words, something that almost never happened to him. At last he stepped closer. "You have avoided me." Eleanor lowered her gaze immediately. "I would never presume such a thing. And yet you no longer smile when I enter a room." The quiet honesty of the words startled even him. Eleanor froze completely. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of her sleeve while emotion flickered briefly across her face before disappearing again beneath composure. "It was never my intention to disturb your peace." Lucien frowned faintly. "You do not disturb it." But Eleanor finally looked up then, and the sadness in her blue eyes struck him harder than anger ever could. "That is precisely the problem." The words landed softly between them. "Heavy. Dangerous." Lucien stared at her without understanding. Eleanor gathered her courage quietly beneath his gaze. "People like me forget themselves very easily when shown kindness they were never meant to receive." Lucien felt something inside his chest tighten painfully. "Eleanor, please." Her voice trembled for the first time since he had known her. "You have already given me more care than I deserve. But storms pass, Your Grace." Rain fell harder beyond the windows while silence swallowed the room whole. Lucien watched her standing there beneath the dim candlelight, pale and fragile, and trying desperately to pull herself away before hope could wound her any further. And suddenly he realized something terrifying. The thought of returning to the emptiness that existed before Eleanor had entered his life no longer felt survivable. Eleanor stepped backward toward the door once more. "Good evening, Your Grace." Then she disappeared quietly into the dark hallway beyond the library. Lucien remained motionless beside the fire long after she left. The untouched tea cooled slowly beside him, while one unbearable truth settled heavily through his chest at last. He had spent years learning how to survive grief. But he had no idea how to survive losing Eleanor now that he had finally begun to see her. 2 nights later, Blackthorn Hall held its first formal gathering in nearly 5 years. The storm had finally cleared completely, leaving the estate wrapped beneath glittering white snow while golden. Lights spilled from every window across the frozen grounds. Music drifted through the grand ballroom once more. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. Noble guests from Boston and New York filled the manor with silk gowns, tailored coats, and carefully practiced laughter. Yet beneath all the elegance, tension lingered quietly through the halls like smoke. Because everyone had noticed the Duke changing, Lucien Ashford no longer vanished into isolation during social events. He no longer ignored conversations entirely. More unsettling still, his eyes seemed to search the ballroom constantly for something no one else could name. Or rather, someone. Eleanor stood near the edge of the East Gallery arranging fresh champagne glasses while distant violin music echoed softly beneath the vaulted ceilings. Mrs. Aldrich had insisted she remain out of sight tonight among the servants. "The guests do not require distractions," the housekeeper had said sharply earlier that evening while adjusting Eleanor's plain gray dress. Eleanor had simply nodded. She understood perfectly. Women like her belonged behind candlelight and closed doors, not beneath chandeliers beside dukes and wealthy families. Yet somehow, standing unseen in crowded rooms hurt more now than it once had. Because Lucien had looked at her differently. And once a lonely heart had been noticed, becoming invisible again felt unbearable. "Miss Vale." Eleanor turned softly at the unfamiliar voice. A young gentleman stood nearby holding a glass of champagne, his warm brown eyes fixed on her with polite curiosity. He could not have been older than 30. "Forgive me," he said with a small smile. "I believe we met briefly during the storm. Theodore Bennett." Eleanor recognized him immediately as one of Lucien's distant guests from Boston. "Of course, sir." Theodore glanced toward the ballroom before lowering his voice slightly. "You seem remarkably calm considering this house intimidates nearly everyone." Eleanor smiled faintly despite herself. "I believe Blackthorn Hall only appears cold until one learns its silences." Theodore laughed softly at that. That is unexpectedly poetic. Before Eleanor could respond, movement across the ballroom suddenly caught Theodore's attention. I suppose I should not monopolize your time further. Eleanor followed his gaze instinctively and froze. Lucien stood near the center of the ballroom, speaking with several guests, though his expression had gone completely still. Gray eyes locked directly onto Eleanor from across the crowded room. Onto Eleanor and Theodore, standing together beside the gallery wall. Something unreadable darkened across Lucien's face instantly. Not anger exactly. Something quieter. Sharper. The violin music continued drifting through the ballroom, while conversations swirled endlessly around him. Yet Lucien heard none of it anymore. Because for reasons he could not explain, the sight of another man making Eleanor smile tightened something painfully possessive inside his chest. Theodore bowed politely toward Eleanor before stepping away into the crowd. But Lucien remained motionless where he stood, watching her far too carefully. Eleanor lowered her gaze almost immediately and turned back toward the silver trays beside her, pretending not to notice the intensity of his stare. Yet several nearby guests already had. Whispered speculation began moving quietly through the ballroom. The Duke has not looked away from that girl once. Who is she? Only a servant, I believe. Lucien heard every word, and for the first time in years, he realized he did not care. Slowly, deliberately, he crossed the ballroom floor. Conversations softened as guests watched him pass beneath the chandeliers in cold astonishment. Eleanor's breath caught faintly the moment she realized where he was walking. Toward her. Lucien stopped directly before her, while music and candlelight surrounded them both. Up close, Eleanor could see exhaustion lingering beneath his eyes alongside something infinitely more dangerous. Need. Your Grace, she whispered carefully. Lucien looked at her for one long silent moment before extending his hand. The entire ballroom seemed to still around them. Dance with me. Eleanor stared at him in complete disbelief. I cannot. You can. Her pulse trembled violently now. People are watching. Lucien's expression softened in a way she had never seen before. Quiet. Certain. Let them. Then, before fear could stop her, Eleanor slowly placed her trembling hand into his. And beneath the stunned gaze of Blackthorn Hall's entire ballroom, Duke Lucien Ashford led the invisible girl everyone had forgotten directly into the center of the light. Silence swept across the ballroom like a sudden winter wind the moment Eleanor Vale placed her hand into Lucien Ashford's. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Crystal glasses paused halfway to waiting lips. Even the orchestra seemed to hesitate for one breath before continuing the waltz softly beneath the chandeliers overhead. Eleanor felt every stare in the room settle upon her at once. Noblewomen whispered behind jeweled fans. Men exchanged startled glances over champagne glasses. Because Duke Lucien Ashford had not danced with anyone since his wife's death 5 years earlier. And now he stood in the center of Blackthorn Hall holding the hand of a quiet servant girl everyone else had overlooked. Your Grace, Eleanor whispered faintly as Lucien guided her carefully onto the ballroom floor. Please reconsider this. But Lucien's hand remained steady against hers. No. The single word carried quiet certainty impossible to resist. Eleanor's pulse trembled painfully as the first notes of the waltz surrounded them. She had not danced in years. Not since before humiliation and heartbreak taught her how dangerous hope could become. Yet Lucien drew her gently into motion as though she were something precious rather than improper. His hand rested lightly against her waist while her fingers trembled softly against his shoulder beneath the candlelight. You are frightened, he murmured quietly. Eleanor forced herself not to look toward the watching crowd surrounding them. I am trying to be sensible. Lucien's gray eyes remained fixed only on her face. And are you always sensible? A faint breath of nervous laughter escaped her before she could stop it. The sound struck Lucien unexpectedly hard. Warmth spread slowly through his chest at hearing it again after days of silence. Only when necessary, Eleanor admitted softly. They moved together across the ballroom, while whispers followed them relentlessly through the crowd. Yet somehow, within Lucien's arms, the noise around her began fading little by little until only the music remained. Only his steady hand guiding her through the dance. You should not do this, Eleanor whispered after a moment, her voice quieter now. People will speak. They already do. Because they do not understand you. Lucien's expression darkened faintly beneath the chandelier light. No, because they do not understand why I suddenly care what happens to one quiet woman inside this house. Eleanor's breath caught sharply. Her steps faltered for half a second before Lucien steadied her instinctively. Around them, the ballroom disappeared into blurred candlelight and distant music. Your Grace, Lucien. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. I cannot call you that. Why? His voice lowered further. Because no one has ever spoken my name the way you do. Emotion tightened painfully inside her chest. Dangerous. Too dangerous. She lowered her gaze quickly. You deserve someone extraordinary. Lucien stopped dancing completely then, drawing them both into stillness at the center of the ballroom, while couples continued moving slowly around them. Look at me. Eleanor hesitated before finally lifting her eyes toward his. The sadness lingering there nearly unraveled him entirely. Lucien's voice softened into something almost breaking. I spent years surrounded by people who admired my title, my wealth, my name. His hand tightened faintly against hers. And not one of them ever truly saw me. Eleanor's breath trembled softly. Lucien stepped closer beneath the golden chandelier light, close enough now that she could hear the quiet strain hidden beneath every controlled word. Then you appeared inside this cold house carrying flowers and tea and kindness no one bothered to notice. His gray eyes never left hers. And somehow, you became the only part of my life that feels warm anymore. Tears gathered instantly in Eleanor's eyes before she could stop them. Not because his words were beautiful, but because they sounded terrifyingly sincere. Lucien, his name slipped from her lips barely above a whisper. Something fragile broke open inside him at the sound. Slowly, carefully, Lucien lifted one hand toward her face. Not possessive, not demanding, just gentle enough to brush one trembling tear from beneath her eye with his thumb. The ballroom had gone nearly silent around them now. Yet Lucien no longer cared who watched. Because for the first time since grief hollowed his world empty, he realized he was no longer dancing out of memory or obligation. He was dancing because Eleanor Vale was finally in his arms. And he had never wanted to let her go. The ballroom never truly recovered after that dance. Even hours later, whispers still drifted through Blackthorn Hall like smoke beneath closed doors. Noblewomen spoke quietly behind lace fans. Older gentlemen exchanged troubled glances over crystal glasses of whiskey. Everyone had witnessed the impossible. Duke Lucien Ashford had looked at a servant girl as though she were the only soul inside the room worth seeing. And Eleanor knew exactly what such attention would cost. By midnight, the guests had finally retired upstairs while servants extinguished candles one chandelier at a time. Snow glimmered outside beneath pale moonlight, covering the estate in silver silence once more. Yet inside Eleanor's chest, peace had vanished completely. She stood alone inside the small music room on the second floor, the same forgotten chamber where Lucien had first spoken of his late wife weeks earlier. Moonlight spilled across the grand piano while cold shadows gathered softly in the corners of the room. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, trying desperately to steady the ache growing inside her heart. Because for one dangerous moment on that ballroom floor, she had almost believed she belonged beside him. A quiet knock interrupted the silence behind her. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly before turning. Lucien stood in the doorway. His dark coat had been discarded somewhere downstairs, leaving only a white shirt slightly loosened at the collar and exhaustion shadowing his gray eyes. Yet even now, he looked only at her. Always at her now. You disappeared, he said quietly. Eleanor forced a small smile that never reached her eyes. The evening became overwhelming. Lucien stepped farther into the room while moonlight brushed silver against his dark hair. You are avoiding me again. Eleanor looked down at her hands. I am trying to protect what remains of your reputation. I do not care about reputation, but I do. Her voice trembled softly before she could stop it. Lucien fell silent at once. Eleanor moved toward the piano slowly, fingertips brushing the polished wood while gathering courage she did not possess. Tonight they looked at me as though I had forgotten my place. Lucien's expression hardened instantly. Your place is wherever you choose to stand. Eleanor shook her head faintly. You speak as though the world is kind. Pain flickered briefly across her face before she forced it away again. It is not. Lucien crossed the distance between them slowly. Then let me protect you from it. Eleanor finally looked up at him then, tears already gathering despite every effort to remain composed. "Do you not understand?" she whispered. "You already have." Silence swallowed the room whole. The grandfather clock somewhere downstairs struck 1 in the morning while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. Eleanor's breathing trembled now beneath the weight of everything she had tried to bury for weeks. "I spent years teaching myself not to want things that were never meant for me," she admitted softly. "Not love. Not belonging. Not someone looking at me the way you do." Lucien's chest tightened painfully at every word. Eleanor stepped backward slowly as though distance alone might save them both. "But now," her voice cracked faintly, "now I wake every morning wondering whether you will smile at me, whether you will say my name, whether this terrible, beautiful feeling inside me will survive another day." Lucien stared at her as though the entire world had narrowed into one trembling soul standing beneath moonlight before him. "Eleanor, and that is precisely why I must leave." The words shattered through the silence between them. Lucien went completely still. Eleanor's tears finally slipped free as she forced herself to continue. "Eventually your guests will return home. Society will move on. They will expect you to forget this." Her blue eyes lifted toward his one final time. "But I will not survive becoming invisible to you again." Something inside Lucien broke then. Sharp, immediate, real. He stepped toward her instantly, his hand catching her wrist gently before she could retreat farther into the shadows. "Do not speak as though this is already over." Eleanor's breath trembled violently beneath his touch. "Lucien." "No," his voice lowered almost painfully now, honest in a way he no longer knew how to control. "I spent 5 years convincing myself my heart died with my wife." His fingers tightened faintly around hers. "Then you walked quietly into my home carrying light I never asked for, but suddenly cannot live without." Tears blurred Eleanor's vision completely now. Lucien lifted his free hand slowly toward her face, resting it gently against her cheek, while moonlight surrounded them both in silver silence. "Do not leave me in that darkness again," he whispered. And for one terrible, beautiful moment, Eleanor almost said yes. Before dawn, Eleanor Vale left Blackthorn Hall. Snow still covered the estate in pale silver beneath the fading night sky, while the entire manor slept in silence. No servants stirred in the hallways. No carriage wheels echoed through the frozen courtyard. Only the quiet sound of Eleanor's footsteps moved softly through the darkness as she carried one small suitcase toward the front entrance alone. Her eyes burned from sleepless tears, but her expression remained calm. She had made her decision hours earlier after leaving the music room, because loving Lucien Ashford felt too beautiful to survive the world waiting outside those walls. And Eleanor could not bear becoming the reason his name was destroyed by whispers and scandal. At the bottom of the staircase, she paused one final time. Candlelight flickered weakly across the grand entrance hall, while snow pressed gently against the towering windows beyond. Blackthorn Hall no longer felt cold to her anymore. That was the cruelest part. Slowly, Eleanor removed a folded letter from her coat pocket and placed it carefully atop the small table beside the door. Then, with trembling fingers, she touched the edge of Lucien's untouched white rose arrangement standing nearby. "Thank you," she whispered softly into the silence. And then she walked away. 2 hours later, Lucien awoke with an unfamiliar sense of wrongness tightening immediately inside his chest. Gray morning light spilled weakly through the curtains of his bedroom, while wind brushed softly against the windows outside. Something felt empty, missing. Before his mind fully understood why, his body already knew. Lucien rose quickly and crossed the room without bothering to dress properly. Moments later, he descended the staircase with growing unease shadowing every step. The manor remained strangely quiet. Too quiet. "Whitmore," Lucien called sharply the moment he entered the entrance hall. The elderly butler appeared almost instantly, startled by the tension in the Duke's voice. "Your Grace." Lucien's eyes caught the folded letter resting upon the table beside the white roses. His pulse stopped cold. Slowly he picked it up. The handwriting alone shattered something inside him. "Lucien, forgive me for leaving without saying goodbye. You once told me this house had become empty after grief stole the light from it. But you were wrong. The warmth returned long before either of us realized. I simply cannot stay long enough to watch the world punish you for caring about someone like me. Please remember this one truth above all others. You were never cold, only lonely. And somewhere along the way, you taught a forgotten girl she was worth seeing after all. Eleanor. Lucian stared at the letter in silence, while panic unlike anything he had ever known spread violently through his chest. Where is she? Whitmore lowered his gaze sadly. One of the stable boys saw Miss Vale leaving before sunrise toward the station road. Lucian was already moving before the sentence finished. Snow flew beneath the carriage wheels less than 10 minutes later as horses thundered down the frozen road leading away from Blackthorn Hall. Wind tore violently through Lucian's dark coat, while his thoughts raced with unbearable clarity. He had lost people before. He understood grief too well. But this felt different, sharper, because Eleanor was not gone yet, which meant he still had one final chance to stop her from disappearing out of his life forever. Nearly 40 minutes later, the small train station appeared through the falling snow ahead. Lucian stepped down from the carriage before it fully stopped. Travelers moved quietly beneath the covered platform, while steam curled thickly from the waiting train nearby. Then he saw her. Eleanor stood alone near the far end of the station, holding her small suitcase against her coat, while snowflakes gathered softly in her brown hair. She looked heartbreakingly small against the gray winter morning. Lucian crossed the platform toward her without hesitation. Eleanor turned at the sound of footsteps and froze completely the moment she saw him. Lucian. His breathing remained uneven from the journey while emotion burned openly through eyes that had once seemed carved entirely from ice. "Do not ask me to survive another empty house," he said quietly. Eleanor's tears appeared instantly. Lucian stepped closer until only inches remained between them beneath the falling snow. "I searched my entire life for peace," he whispered, "only to discover it existed inside your smile." Eleanor looked at him through trembling tears while winter wind surrounded them both in white silence. Then slowly, impossibly gently, she smiled. And for the first time in many years, Duke Lucian Ashford finally felt his heart begin to live again.